I honestly thought Caitlin Clark looked like a natural in this game. It was a lot of high volume shooting from three. I wonder if that was perhaps sort of the drill they were running. They didn't go inside quite as much. It was a lot of her getting looks from behind the arc, but she looked really comfortable, and it looked like Dallas actually had to do a couple of rotations to figure out the right person to put on her, which is also what we saw in college. So while I think Indiana still has some balance to figure out sort of with how they want to move the ball with their starting five and also how they want to rotate to their bench, I just don't think that Clark is going to have perhaps as steep of growing pains in the WNBA as some people feared. Hello and welcome everybody to this week's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. It is Monday, May 6th, and we have a lot to discuss. We've got WNBA preseason, some first looks for some superstars in their WNBA jerseys. Very exciting. And then we also are going to talk through a packed week of NWSL action where we learned some things about some teams that had to dig deep on short rest this week. And then at the end, we're trying something new. We're going to do a quick news roundup. So if there's anything we missed in the prior two sections, hopefully we'll have cleanup there at the end of the episode. But that's enough to start us out here. Let's get into it. All right. So let's talk about some new stuff that happened this weekend. We will get to NWSL in the second block here, but I actually want to start with WNBA preseason. So we got our first glimpses of some of these high-profile rookies playing for the WNBA teams for the first time, kind of unofficially, but we're getting some looks at some of the roster construction coming together for the WNBA, and this is all going to happen very fast. The WNBA starts next week, so we get a couple preseason games. We get roster cuts coming in real fast and furious. See these teams come together very, very quickly. So it's worth it, I think, to take a second to talk about preseason because this is going to be actually our only chance to do so before the season actually starts. So again, you don't want to put too much weight on certainly what happens in these games, who wins, who loses. Teams are over-rotating. They are resting players who maybe came back from Europe or are managing minutes. They're keeping everybody healthy, and they're determining usually their bench. Usually figuring out your best starting rotation is something that you're willing to do further into the regular season. They need to figure out who players, 6 through 12 are for these teams. That's where preseason does, though, get interesting because what we see is sort of this over-rotating. We're seeing players who maybe will get fewer minutes during the actual regular season get more time in these games. And you can start to sort of game the system, right? Of sort of seeing like, okay, this player played this many minutes and they did this well and their plus minus looked like this. And do we think that they fit in with the scheme of the team? Do they fit in with what they're able to do while their starters are rested? And this is also where we begin to see these first glimpses of what these rookies can do after a very exciting NCAA tournament. So these games are crucial, but they're also not defining. So I'm about to prep everybody. These cuts are going to be rough, whether it's rookies or former NCAA players that you've become attached to. Maybe some people come in with more notoriety than they even have maybe for fit on a WNBA team. You're seeing players who actually perhaps are displaced by this year's rookies. I think that's a possibility too with the strength of this rookie class. You're going to see veterans who have put years in the league. You're going to see players who maybe are looking for fresh starts in different teams, not get the looks that they need. You're going to see players that people care about not make it onto these opening day rosters. However, it's not the end of the road for these players. There's a lot of different opportunities. Sometimes they return for short-term hardship contracts later in the season. Sometimes you see them in training camps the following year. We've seen a number of players last year who struggled to stay on rosters come back this year, give it a second shot. You might even see them in Europe. These players sometimes have to get more overseas in order to come back and bring that experience, that professional experience with them to have a better shot at a WNBA roster. But to sort of do the big headline here, a lot of these rookies look pretty good. Again, like I said, it's not total competition. We're not seeing players go out of their way to run the floor, to be overly physical. That's not the point. But in terms of sort of immediate growing pains, we're seeing a lot of players really execute, which I thought was exciting. I think maybe the biggest headline, let's start with Caitlin Clark, right? She got her first game with the Indiana Fever against Dallas over the weekend. She scores 21 points on high volume shooting. She makes 5 threes, so 5 shots from behind the arc. High volume. She was really slinging it from deep all game. I'm not sure that's always what Indiana's going to want from her. I think they're probably going to want to get the pick and roll going with Aaliyah Boston a little bit more, find Boston inside a little bit more. But it was good to get those reps in. It seemed like some of the messaging from Indiana for some of their starters is just like, let's go get some shots up. Let's go high volume. Let's see how we do. Let's see how we feel with different defensive assignments on us. Look at the outside game because we know the inside game will work because Boston is so reliable. I really enjoyed the speed of play in this game between Indiana and Dallas. It was quick. Again, no one was getting overly physical. I thought that was good. I kind of see these teams somewhat similar, Dallas and Indiana, in sort of where they're at, trying to rise. Dallas has a little bit more established experience in the postseason recently than Indiana does, but these are two teams that are very much trying to build on previous seasons. They have some length inside, but they also have some really good stretch shooters. I think both of these teams are going to be moving high tempo, and I think we saw that with both teams here. They were moving the ball very quickly, trying to get some inside-outside looks, not just go hard in the paint, which I think is a good use of a preseason game. We also had a little bit of a Big Ten reunion immediately, like you talk about some of the continuity of the storylines from NCAA to the WNBA. Immediately, we got J.C. Sheldon on Clark for a fair amount of this game. So J.C. Sheldon, known as sort of the quarterback of that Ohio State team, who is kind of she was drafted very high by Dallas, number 5 overall, to be sort of a 3-and-D look for the Wings. So she's probably coming off of the bench. She's going to have very specific defensive assignments. She's not the tallest player in the world, so she's not going to be driving to the arc, but she does a lot of kind of dribbling into the paint, kicking it back out for threes, and then also just kind of being hell on defense, right? She really did her best on Clark. There was one photo that went viral, and it was classified as a crossover, and I would like to stick up for J.C. Sheldon here. It was not a crossover. She did a nice job on Clark, and she also did a nice job, again, moving the ball quickly up the court, which is what Dallas is going to want to do to be able to best execute their transition offense. She got 2 threes, 100%. Didn't take too many shots, but that's kind of her role. Be hell on defense, make your 3-pointers when you've got a wide open look. I liked what I saw from J.C. Sheldon. I also want to note, this is a good example of what I was talking about before, of a player who perhaps doesn't always have the best training camp immediately out of college or doesn't have the opportunity out of college, goes to Europe, comes back better. The real star in terms of a rookie in this game was Dallas's Jaylen Brown, who is a player who did not get drafted last year. She went and played an entire European season, and now she's back, and she understands that this is her shot to make a WNBA team. She has 21 points in this game for the Wings. This is a really good example of how this is not actually always the end of the road for these players. Jaylen Brown did not get the look that she needed going into the WNBA right out of college. She goes to Europe, she improves, she comes back a pro's pro, scores 21 points, and Dallas is, to be honest, only preseason game. This is a good example, again, of just how truncated this schedule is. Dallas only got 1 preseason game this year. Their head coach, Latricia Trammell, said on the broadcast, she said, this is it. These are the looks that we're getting in competition, and we have to make cuts based on what we see here. They've been trying to do a lot of scrimmaging, a lot of closed door stuff, but it's interesting just to see how these teams have to deal with the limited resources of time and programming that they have. I think it was the Aces that also said that they're only going to have 1 preseason game this year. So really important game. You say preseason, results don't matter, but the performances really do, because they set the tone for what we're going to be seeing at the beginning of the season. For Indiana, they look like their starting 5 is pretty much set. They're working Clark in. They're kind of trying to build that chemistry between her and Alyssa Smith. That worked really well this weekend. Again, they didn't involve Aaliyah Boston as much. I imagine that's something they're going to continue to keep working on. Maybe that's also just something that they know that they have and they didn't need to practice in a game state. But those players, that mix, I think they feel really confident about. They feel good about Alyssa Smith, Clark, Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, Erica Wheeler, Lexi Hull. These players that I think they know are going to be sort of this young core with a couple veteran additions. But their bench, I don't know how attached we can get to Indiana's bench right now. I thought some of their further rotating kind of showed some of the thinness of maybe confidence coming off the bench that they have. I thought that Ohio State's Celeste Taylor looked a little bit timid. I thought Indiana's Grace Berger, who's coming into her second year, looked a little bit timid. They need to kind of figure out those role players. Like, for example, like I say, a player like J.C. Sheldon, maybe not a starter, but she's so clear in what she wants to do coming off the bench. Those are the players that Indiana still needs to build around this young core. Otherwise, the grind of a full WNBA season is going to be a little bit of a struggle, because what we saw from Indiana last year was that they were very good at being in close games, but they didn't quite have what they needed to get over the top. And sometimes that means clear roles off the bench. So love that game. Thought it was great. We also got to see Cameron Brink and Rickea Jackson in action for LA for the first time. Both players also looked pretty good. They did not play too many minutes. I think that, again, the Sparks are kind of doing a lot of heavy rotating, figuring out how to get people enough minutes to execute, but not over rely on them going into the season. Brink had 11 points. Jackson had 10. Brink had a couple nice blocks. Jackson had some good rebounds. I think Jackson is still kind of really trying to get that mid-range shooter or jumper to go, which she had some hits. She had some misses, but if she can start getting that thing to roll, that is going to be a kind of shot that WNBA teams are really going to struggle to defend. I think this is maybe a good example of a team where you might see these rookies start to displace some people on that LA roster. LA has some roster spots to work with. They are clearly investing in that young group that they think is going to help kind of with this managed rebuild. We also saw some veterans play quite well. Dearica Hamby had a very good game. Kia Nurse had a very good game. But I'm curious to see what the infusion of Brink and Jackson does to some of maybe the second or third year players, whether with just the Sparks themselves or in the league, whether we see a more concentrated group of veterans that have already executed in the league well with different teams, and these truly young players, or if there is room on this roster for some of those players in between who I thought got really good minutes last year. But then how do you build on that? Because the Sparks obviously ultimately want to be back in the playoff conversation sooner rather than later. For Seattle, which was the team that they played this game up in Canada. This was the annual WNBA Canada game, which I think, again, just went really well. I think there's a huge audience in Canada for the WNBA. I would be excited to see a team there eventually. They are in a different position than a team like LA. The way they would approach a preseason game would probably be completely different. They have actual starters that they need to get game time together. They need to get Nneka Ogwumike and Skylar Diggins-Smith and Jewell Loyd these reps. They are all in on sort of this free agent class, and they have a lot of veteran leadership, and they have these longtime players. Like, honestly, Jewell Loyd looked fantastic in that game. LA did go on to win, but you kind of look at the way that Seattle's starters, started this game and how they played when they were on the court, and you go, maybe if Seattle was playing to win, this might have gone a little bit differently. I thought that Diggins-Smith and Loyd already are building some really nice rapport. There was a beautiful lob it was probably the best play of the whole game, from Diggins-Smith to Jewell Loyd. They were moving the ball well. That's going to be really fun to watch. So for a team like Seattle, when they are exploring their depth, they're doing it from a different position. They're not asking rookies to come in and say, are you going to displace players on this roster? Are you going to start for us? They are asking depth players, where they have a variety of different experience, and young players to build around a veteran core, as opposed to, like I said, going back to Indiana or going back to LA. So what they were trying to get out of this game was different, but that also just kind of makes it fun for the basketball nerds, because you can be like, ooh, I see what they're doing there with this scheme, and then you kind of look at what LA is doing, and it's a little bit more individually based probably on LA. Notably, for talking about Seattle depth, Nika Mule was not able to participate in the Canada game because of call it scheduling, call it anything. The fact that Nika Mule is in the United States on a student visa as a player for UConn, that did not get switched over to a professional visa in time for her to be able to travel across nation borders to go play in Canada. I think there's been some good messaging from Seattle about this. You could see how that would really derail a rookie trying to make a roster, to feel like, oh my gosh, I can't play in this game. This is a big game. It's a huge, huge crowd. This is my chance to really show off, to show the coach what I can do. Noelle Quinn has been pretty steadfast in saying that Mule will get her shot. But man, you talk about making these rosters. Sometimes these factors are razor thin, truly razor thin, whether it's a little bit of a knock that you pick up in training, or whether it's something like this where you can't play in this game, so you have fewer game minutes to kind of show off what you can do. The margins are so thin, and it's not just the lack of roster size, but it's also just kind of the way the schedule works going from college to the pros. I really enjoyed the Canada game. Again, I really like that the WNBA does this. I like that they have a Canadian broadcast, and they stream that nationally in the United States. I really enjoyed that. All really fun. However, if you are a women's sports fan, you might have heard the vibes were not all so good across the weekend. Despite WNBA League Pass saying at the beginning of the week that all of the weekend's games were going to be streamed, there was actually not a stream for Chicago's game against Minnesota, despite a huge amount of demand. We've talked a little bit about these needle movers for each of these WNBA teams. I think you can certainly say that Camila Cardoso and Angel Reese are huge needle movers for the Chicago Sky, and there were a lot of people who wanted to see that game and wanted to see them compete together for the Sky for the first time. That did not happen. It was kind of a funny scene online. A couple of fans just got streams going on their phones from inside the arena. You had hundreds of thousands of people tuning in at various times. You had like VIPs in the stream, VIPs in the chat, like Dawn Staley and Flau'jae Johnson. It was, in a way, it was like kind of cute, but it was also just, I think, frustrating for many fans who wanted to feel like they were supporting the team that they want to support and felt like there were resources to do so. The issue appears to be somewhat of a centralization versus non-centralization issue with the streams, which is that the WNBA does not pay for every preseason stream. This is actually, I believe, even with sort of this Chicago Sky debacle, this is actually the most preseason games they've had streamed so far in their recent history. And so because there was no local broadcast in the Minnesota market, there was no local broadcast for them to boost and run on League Pass. The WNBA kind of sticks by their centralization policy. They say, we want to hit those big games. We don't have the resources to do a centralized stream for every single game. But it seems like they also don't have minimum standards in each local market. So, the Lynx are owned by the same ownership as the Timberwolves. The Timberwolves are in the playoffs right now. That seemed to be something that kind of messed with both scheduling and the ability to do a broadcast. It just seems like an issue of communication, resources, and I guess just a little bit of like willpower that we do see with the WNBA from time to time. Would love to see either minimum standards set for local markets, more resources essentially from the WNBA themselves, or just a larger general communication between those two entities so that fans know what's going on so that we don't get stuck watching games on a cell phone stream in the arena. The good news is that the Chicago Tribune announced today that Chicago will have a stream for their second game, which is going to be on Tuesday. We're recording this on Monday, May 6th. But just more growing pains. We talk about the play on the court, but always just sort of good to check in on how the WNBA is managing this moment, because it's a very important moment for the league. Probably you look at years past, you say you could be overly pragmatic, perhaps like the WNBA has been in the past. They say, well, there's never been a huge market for preseason streams for WNBA games. That's never been something that we've had thousands of people interested in before. And then you could counter that by saying, well, of course that was going to be different this year. Why is the league being reactive instead of proactive? Why wasn't this a conversation that they knew was going to come up? I think that that's going to be the ongoing conversation throughout the year, depending on sort of what we see in local. It is just sort of that push-pull of what are local markets set up to be able to handle themselves. What does the WNBA have centralized? What rules do the WNBA have to either empower or at least oversee some of those minimum standards in each local market? And how does that manifest in hopefully a good experience for fans and players? However, again, this is a game I did not watch, but it seems like Angel Reese's in particular stats were pretty good. 13 points, 9 rebounds, 5 of which were O boards. It's exactly what she's been brought onto this team to do. Cardoso played fewer minutes, but she had 6 points, 4 rebounds. I think she picked up a little bit of a knock. They were overly cautious. I think that makes perfect sense. Saw some more growing pains, I think, from a player like Alyssa Pilley from Minnesota. Only 1 of 7 from the floor. Struggled from 3, didn't hit a 3-pointer in that game. But just sort of hitting it off the box score. Again, just sort of what we expected, which is for a team like Chicago, which is going to expect some of these players to play more, to start more, to build this young core around some of these key vets. Some really promising returns. For a team like Minnesota that is maybe asking a player like Pilley to sort of grow and learn and change within, we can see kind of the starting point of what that looks like at the professional level. But just an interesting weekend. I think that these roster conversations are fascinating. I think that it allows you to really get into the weeds when you want to get into the nitty-gritty of what these different benches look like, which is hopefully helpful for understanding the entire context of a season for these teams as opposed to just some of their key stars. And some other quick WNBA notes just from what we saw around the weekend. Another game I did not get a chance to catch, but Aaliyah Edwards saw her first action for the Mystics. Solid stats. Again, 6 points, 4 rebounds. Her plus minus was very good on this game. That's what you want to see. Come in, have an efficient solid impact on the game, both offensively and defensively. And then interestingly, Atlanta, who is playing the Mystics, their top performer was arguably Destiny Henderson. Again, another example of a player who struggled to retain a spot on a roster last year. She works in the offseason, comes back, 2022 NCAA champion with South Carolina. And she played the most minutes for Atlanta game, which is hopefully a positive sign. I think sometimes you can see correlation between limited minutes and perhaps upcoming cuts. So I'm rooting for Henny. I really like Destiny Henderson. So thought that was another good example of how this isn't always the end of the road right away. So moving from preseason to regular season to the debuts to some sort of established players here, we're going to move on to the world of soccer. Had another super packed week of NWSL games. There were a couple of midweek matches before the full weekend slate. Couple of teams coming off of 3-game weeks, which is where you can start to really rattle off results in one direction or the other. It's great for me because I get to kind of look at, okay, what happened in a quick sort of 1, 2, 3 succession, rather than feeling like perhaps you're just grabbing onto individual performances, because we are getting to the point where we're starting to see arcs, we're starting to see trends, we're starting to see streaks. So let's talk positive streaks. Let's talk winning streaks. I think we have to start. I feel like I've been talking about them a lot, but what a turnaround. Portland is on a 4-game winning streak, taking all 3 games this week. Sophia Smith has 7 goals in 8 games. And they are now, the Thorns now sort of in this run are conceding on average about a goal a game, which for them is an improvement. Their defense was having a lot of trouble at the beginning of the season. So still not perfect from the defense, but they are doing a lot better at sort of a full team, cohesive defensive plan starting from the forwards that is limiting other teams' opportunities. They're still kind of getting into shootouts, but very impressive to see the turnaround from Portland. I think we'll always go back to ask the question, is it chicken or the egg? Was it because they moved Mike Morris that they started playing better, or was this always coming? I want to talk about Orlando. They are on a 5-game winning streak. They haven't lost a single game yet. They are still unbeaten in 8 games. I believe Opta said that they are the first team to do so since North Carolina in 2018. As people remember, that was an incredibly good team. They currently sit atop the NWSL table, though Kansas City does still have a game in hand. I think more specifically what excites me about Orlando, and we'll go deep on this in a second, is that it's not just unbeaten. I think sometimes unbeaten can be something of a nebulous stat. Does that mean that you're tying a lot? Does it mean that you're giving up leads? Does it mean that you're coming back to fight for results? Results are important, but if you are unbeaten and also you've won your last 5, that's a very different look at a team than perhaps going back to the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season that was mostly getting draws. Less of an exciting result for Kansas City, but they are also still unbeaten in 7 games. They'll play their 8th on Wednesday. They had an extended rain delay in their game against Houston this weekend, so Houston did come back to tie this game 1-1, but I don't want Kansas City to fall into this trap where we talk about them a little bit less just because they've been so consistently excellent. Weird game. They're going into a tough week, so I'm very interested to see how this goes for them, but they are also undefeated in 7 games, have a chance to go back atop the table with a win on Wednesday. So let's dig into some of these teams here at the top, because it's a continuation of some of the topics that we've already discussed, but we're seeing perhaps these proof of concepts go deeper and deeper and turn into really impressive actual results, which is ultimately what everything is about. At the end of the day, if you want the shield, you got to get those points. And the way you can show that character and separate yourself from the rest of the field is, again, during these short week, quick game weeks, short rest, quick game weeks, where you have to rotate. You don't have a choice. You can't play your best 11 every single game. You have to have structural, formational approaches that allow your players to rest while also maintaining their shape defensively, while also setting up the ability to score. So let's start with Orlando. Top of the table, scoring goals, defending leads. Are the Pride for real? I think I've said this before. Sometimes the Pride are a little bit difficult to take at their word when they're playing well. They've had good streaks in the past. I think it was just a couple of years ago that Orlando spent a fair amount of the beginning of the season at the top of the table before fading down the stretch. Don't know if there's a fade in their future here, but right now it looks like the real deal. So first of all, Barbara Banda has to be one of the MVP frontrunners at this point, despite only playing 4 games. She almost single-handedly dismantled North Carolina midweek, and that allowed them to hopefully be able to rest a little bit more players once you go ahead. She's, just an incredible attacking output from her. But then I think that allowed them this weekend to showcase a different kind of result. So they had a game against Louisville this weekend. They did not sort of have the early success that they had in the game against North Carolina, because as we know, that changes the tenor of a match. They do get one goal early, courtesy of Banda. But they have to hold on to a 1-goal lead for the rest of this game. They do kind of, for them, attack is their best defense. There was this barrage against Louisville. We thought maybe they were going to get a second goal. They didn't. Louisville is not a bad team either. This was actually their first loss on the season. Very structurally sound. They think they struggled a little bit just with sort of creativity in the attack to find the equalizer, but not an easy team to break down at all. And Orlando hasn't been injury-free. In this sort of wild, crazy, fantastic win over North Carolina, they lose midfielder Angelina to what seems to be a pretty significant knee injury. What it is now hasn't been confirmed, but it did not look good on the pitch, and she's been in a brace in recent days, so doesn't look good. They've been trying to get Morgan Gautrat back on the field, building minutes back up. Marta has also been dealing with a few knocks as of late, so they haven't always had the players, their impact players or some of their impact players available to them. So going into this game this weekend, knowing that they were going to have limited availability to some of those players that played so fantastically on Wednesday, they were willing to make a few structural formation changes. It was a little bit of a lopsided defense. We've seen this sometimes with the United States. It's kind of an imbalanced back four where you have one very attacking fullback and one very defensive fullback. It allows you basically to fall into a back four when you need to defend, but also gives you those extra numbers going forward. And again, when you maybe don't have all of your best creative players, just numbers forward can make a big difference. And the way they get the opening goal is actually their help side fullback, Emily Sams, makes an impromptu run at the back line. She finds Banda. That's the only goal of the game. So when you ask if a team is for real, and that's kind of what I'm getting down to here, it's not always about just the singular star players or the occasional big score line, though those are very important, and sometimes just great players can will teams to results, certainly to at least a playoff spot. But it's also what happens when the chips are down. Short rest, dealing with injury, travel. And Orlando getting through this week really kind of proved that they could do that. And it didn't really feel like sort of fluke games or fluke approach. The first game, they had a couple individual players just kind of play out of their minds, get ahead against a good team, and they were able to hold on to that lead. And then in the second game, they were just very structurally sound against another very structurally sound team, and they were set up for a 1-0 grind, even when they didn't get that second goal. Though, like I said, attacking-wise, I thought they played very, very well. So I like Orlando. I like what Seb Heisd is doing. I like, obviously, what their attack is doing. Ali Watt also just had another really good game this weekend, last Wednesday. She's a fantastic player. I'm so happy to see her have some partnerships up top that are utilizing some of her skills and abilities. I think Orlando has the right mix. They've got, like I said, I mentioned Sam's. I think that their defense has quietly been improving over the last 2 years. I think Sam's played very well. She can play in 2 different positions. Really interesting player. And they're finding the attack. And I think they're just holding the midfield well enough. The loss of Angelina is a big one, but they're making some of these adjustments with some of their young players to have them in the right places to be able to mitigate some of their absences. So big believer in Orlando. I think well-deserved top of the table for now. Let's move on maybe to a team as a counterpoint, which I still think is for real, and I still think they're going to win a lot of games, but they just still feel slightly less sturdy, is Portland. I think you have to begin and end this with Sophia Smith, right? She has been in incredible form. She's been scoring multi-goal games over the last 2 weeks. Her contributions have been so vast. Sometimes it feels like she's creating things out of nothing. Sometimes it's the right assist. I think in this game against Washington, it was a little bit less in the attack, but it was more what she was giving to the defense, full team defense. From the forward line, she was everywhere. She was committed to getting in trenches and making it very difficult for Washington to advance the ball. I like that out of her as a player. I just do think we are seeing the growth of Sophia Smith into a more all-around forward before our eyes. However, I think when you see a player working like that, maybe it translates to perhaps someone like Trinity Rodman last year for the Washington Spirit, is it sometimes means that she's been given this task because she has to kind of paper over defensive deficiencies. I just think that back line is still struggling with pace, sometimes struggling with positioning. They are having some trouble not giving goals up, giving quick goals up. But I do think it's very heartening for Portland that they went into this battle with Washington, though Washington seemed a little bit low energy just after all the travel they had to do this week. But those were two very good teams. Those are two teams that I think are going to make the playoffs. And Portland was able to get enough system goals from a player like Sam Coffey, or they got a nice tap in from Christine Sinclair. You get those off of set pieces. You move the ball well, and you'll be able to, as a group, kind of that rest defense idea, as a group, play full team defense and don't put the pressure on your back line. It's possible that Portland will be able to do that for the rest of the season. It's completely possible. But I always just wonder, and I've seen this in the past, where when you do have certain players trying to cover up for space deficiencies or pace deficiencies in your back line, that can hit a plateau later in the season. So just very interested to see how this looks for Portland. It also seems possible that they have maybe lost Morgan Weaver for a significant amount of time. Unfortunately, she hurt her knee midweek, and she was wearing a very large knee brace on Saturday. So hopefully Weaver will be fine in the future, but doesn't look amazing there. But it worked, it worked this weekend. It worked on Wednesday, and I think they just need to keep riding that momentum and hope that some of that sturdiness in the back gets learned or develops over the rest of the season. Because if you can win the shootouts, take the points, and keep working on getting better later. So I'm going to hit a couple other teams that I think are worth highlighting. Kansas City, like I said, had sort of an interesting weekend. They had to wait for hours to resume the second half of this game against Houston. It was kind of a bummer, actually. It was supposed to be the game on CBS, on the flagship CBS this weekend. Because of the rain delay, they lost the window. I actually think Kansas City did well not to completely lose their cool. And shout out to Houston for coming back and showing the ability to stay focused in that sort of an environment. The Current have a midweek game this week. They travel to Seattle, and I think that was slightly also disrupted by the length of this Sunday game. So I'm curious to see how this week goes for them. I think Seattle is another very interesting team and sort of trying to bounce back. So very fascinating matchup for them on Wednesday. Washington, I mentioned that they did lose to Portland over the weekend, but they had such an impressive midweek win over Chicago. I got to see that game, and I was really happy I got to see that game in person, because sometimes, obviously, when you're watching a soccer game specifically in person, you're able to see some of the off-ball attributes that a team has, and I think that Washington's off-ball attributes are almost as impressive as their on-ball attributes. They're playing this dual pivot number 6 midfield with rookie Hal Hirschfeld alongside Andy Sullivan. They completely took the midfield away from Chicago in this game, and it's that ability to shore up numbers in the defensive midfield that gives a player like rookie Croy Bethune the ability to sort of float, focus on connecting with Trinity Rodman, connecting with Sarr up top. That is how it works for Washington, and I think that's the beginning of seeing perhaps the vision of, I think we've mentioned in the past, Barcelona coach Jonathan Heraldez is going to be coming in. He's going to be implementing his style. You can kind of see the shades of that already happening. Will they be able to play just like Barcelona? I mean, there's a big question mark there, but you can see some of those basic midfield ideas already being implemented, and they're working really well to, again, give Washington a chance at system wins, not just individual performance wins. Though Trinity Rodman has been very, very excellent, both in victory and in defeat this week, actually. She's reaching a level to her game that I'm not sure we've seen totally in the past. Very hopeful that this will continue into the international level. She got an assist and a goal on Wednesday. She got an assist on Sunday. There were 3 assists for Croy Bethune on Wednesday. This team is really creative. They are very, like I said, structurally sound in a way that allows their attacking players to focus just on that. Though they do come and they do help on defense, but they can trust the line behind them in that defensive midfield to break things up. And that it's incredible what that can do for an attack when they don't have to always be thinking about coming back, pinning back, getting the ball back, generating turnovers deep. It's a really, really nice attribute to have for a team. So I feel good about Washington, despite the loss to Portland. It's like you see those two kinds of teams where you have one where you have maybe the front line working a little bit more to defend, and then you have the other where they feel like they feel good about their midfield, but they also, both these teams have to rotate because of the short rest week, and then Portland wins that one. They're going to win games like that. But I just like what Washington is doing, and I think they're going to be able to do it consistently. So real quick, before we go off of NWSL, I want to take a look at a few less exciting streaks, but shout out to the Reign who broke theirs. They get a win after 5 losses. They take down San Diego 2-1 despite playing with 10 for a lot of the game. Not a lot of control in this game in general. I think there's still a lot of questions to ask for both of these sides. San Diego kind of interesting to see their follow-up to that Shield winning season last year. They have some big question marks, I think, still just in the midfield. That could not have felt good for them not to be able to take the full result, or actually any points from that game after Seattle went down to 10 early on. Utah has no wins in their last 5 games. They have 4 losses in that same streak. They look a little bit lost right now. Game plan, which is sort of more the sturdy off-ball, very defensive mindset, and their roster, which is more attacking-minded players with less of a defensive background. They feel at odds. Seems like there's maybe deeper review right now in both roster strategy and current tactics with this group. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think you can see how you want to have at least more positive play as an expansion side, even if you aren't getting the results. Speaking of expansion sides, Bay FC have now lost 4 in a row. They don't always lose games the exact same way, which I think is actually a good sign. They're not really built up, again, for the NWSL grind that we see kind of week in and week out, which is a pretty standard expansion team issue of depth. But they also can't really hold on to their leads. Their world-class attack is kind of being outblanked by a lack of cohesion in the back line. They're still very fun to watch, but it doesn't feel like every player on that team is on the same page, and especially when you start having to rotate, how do you get results out of these games is the question for Bay FC. And then kind of a quiet one, North Carolina, 2-game losing streak. I guess you can blame Barbara Banda, going God mode on Wednesday, or kind of the short week exhaustion, too many games, not enough rest. You look at a variety of outside factors. I still like North Carolina. I think maybe what we are seeing, though, and I'm very curious for them, if it still becomes part of trusting the system, or if it becomes more about maybe looking for a transfer, or maybe just waiting for one big return. But I think with North Carolina, they're sort of missing an attacking North Star, right? Which it's fairly obvious why that is. Caroline, who was last year's MVP, is out with an ACL injury. It's kind of leaving them without answers when games get stretched out of their comfort zone. I think we've seen their system work so well for them, where they try to hold the ball. They want to be very methodical with the way they possess. The reason why they think they can win these games without one kind of, overall incredible attacker is because they're going to generate chances through their system, through their passing. However, sometimes in NWSL games, the result starts going away from you, and you sort of do need that. You need sort of that special moment from an individual player, and I'm not entirely sure who that player is for North Carolina. So for them, I mean, like I said, I don't think they're going to change their system anytime soon. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But there is more this question of who do they have playing up top? What do you do when you are running out of time to get those system wins? Do you go to the transfer market? Do you wait for Caroline's return, which I think theoretically could happen maybe at the end of the season? Just interesting what that looks like for North Carolina. But they're going to stay the course, I think. I think their whole thing is consistency, and I think that will continue to serve them well. So yeah, just really interesting NWSL week. Like I said, we have more midweek games this week before more games next weekend. Lots of games coming fast and furious. If you're watching your team, I think my final point on NWSL is I've spoken to or heard from a number of NWSL coaches this week who I think you can kind of tell they're in survival mode. When you have 3 games in a week, when you are traveling a lot, you can't always put your best foot forward. You don't really have time to train. You have to manage injuries. Like if you have like a young player and you think, oh, this young player should be starting, they need to play. Maybe they're managing something. Maybe even if they're not on the availability report, it's a matter of not burning a player out so early in the season. So if you're a fan of one of these teams and you're not recognizing the team in front of you after a hot start, survival mode. Feel for each team, feel for the players. They'll get through this, but I just always think you do also see, though, the best of these teams through some of these adverse conditions. So very interested in what we saw from NWSL. And then real quick, I just want to add a little section here today. We might keep it, we might not, I don't know. Let me know if you guys like it or not, but I just want to do a quick fire news roundup because we don't want to miss too much, a lot happening in the world of women's sports. I'm just going to read the news, not a lot of analysis because I would like just to keep everyone informed. The transfer portal for the NCAA basketball season has closed. USC, UConn, big winners. Oregon State and Stanford struggling, especially with conference realignment, saw some players step away. Obviously, Stanford also had a very high-profile retirement of their head coach, Tara Vanderveer. USC picked up Talia von Oelhoffen from Oregon State and Kiki Iriafen from Stanford. They're going to go play with Juju Watkins. That is going to be a super team incoming in LA. Excited about that. UCLA also, I think, had a strong offseason, so that's going to be fascinating to see those teams join the Big Ten. UConn snagged Princeton point guard Caitlin Chen to slide right into that Nika Mule role with all their returning and incoming players. UConn also obviously got a very high-profile recruit in Sarah Strong. They have a number of very good players returning. UConn's going to be very good next year. Haley Van Lith did ultimately transfer to TCU, who have an interesting roster going in the Big 12. Notre Dame also made some big moves under the wire, and I think they could also be stellar next year. Notre Dame, team to watch. Moving on to the world of soccer, European soccer, the Del race is still on. Chelsea and Manchester City could still finish level on points after Man City surprisingly perhaps lost to Arsenal this weekend. Chelsea had opened the door for a Manchester City WSL title. Now they again have the ability to finish tied on points. Chelsea also made up goal differential with an 8-0 win this weekend. So you're going to want to tune into the final weekend. It's going to be wild. Chelsea still has one game in hand. They have to win against Tottenham, but all could be to play for in the last weekend of Emma Hayes' career as Chelsea manager. We saw Barcelona clinch Liga F. We saw Bayern Munich clinch the German league. The Barcelona quadruple is still an option in Heraldez's final season with Barcelona. They still have, I think, one more domestic cup and then obviously the Champions League final to play. And then in hockey, the playoffs are set. Toronto, Montreal, Boston, and Minnesota will be playing in the semifinals of the inaugural season of the PHL. Shout out to Ottawa, who did fall in the final game of the regular season to allow Minnesota to clinch. Exciting end to the regular season for the PWHL. Going to be a fierce competition in the postseason for the first time. Excited to watch. So that's just my little news roundup. Let me know if you guys like it. Want to hit on as many things as possible before we move on next week. So this has been The Late Sub. I have been your host, Claire Watkins. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. We will have NWSL, WNBA, and I'm sure a variety of other good things to talk about next week. Thanks everybody for hanging out, and we will see you next time.